Hello, everyone. My name is Daniela Pisoyu. I'm Scientific Director at Zenor, and I want to warmly welcome you to the final conference of the RECODAR project with the title Far-Right Hate Speech Online, Too Late to Stop? It's a great pleasure to have you with us today on this very special occasion of the closure of the project. In the following few minutes, I will give you a quick overview of how we want to spend the next roughly 1.5 hours. So first, there will be a short intervention on my side, providing you with the main insights gathered during the last 2 years in the RECODAR project, in which we mapped the right-wing and German-speaking extremist ecosystem online driving hate speech. This will be followed by a keynote by Professor Stuart MacDonald on the use of AI to detect hate speech online, and a panel discussion, including next to Stuart also Birgitte Hanshus. Dr. Hanshus is with the Center for Research on Extremism in Norway. We also have the pleasure of having Dr. Evian Leidig of the ICCT, equally famous International Center for Counterterrorism, in the Netherlands, and also our own Eric Hacker of Zenor. We will have 2 Q&A sessions, one right after the keynote speech for questions that really relate to the keynote, and one after the panel discussion. You can, of course, pose questions already during the event in the live chat anytime, and we will pick them up from there. Please try to be concise on the questions and to the point. Thank you so much. By the way, we also offer simultaneous interpretation of the event in German, and we have a dedicated channel with the interpretation into German on YouTube. You will find the link in the description. Also, a quick reminder to finish up on these administrative details at the beginning. The meeting will be recorded for documentation reasons. So with your participation, you agree with this recording. All right, as announced, I will start off with a very short introduction of, well, I guess an overview by now of our project RECODAR, which was initially, of course, titled with a longer title, Right-Wing Extremist Ecosystems, Driving Hate Speech, Dissemination and Recruitment Strategies. This is a project that is EU funded and was carried out in cooperation with Modusad, which is a similar research institution like ours working in Germany. Well, how did we start? It was initially an assumption that there will be a strong presence on TikTok on the side of right-wing extremist actors. And we also assumed that there will be linkages from the TikTok platform to other smaller platforms. Now, of course, there was already research on the far right online as a topic. It wasn't new at all. However, at the time, there wasn't much on specifically TikTok. There was research on Telegram, for example, and of course, on other languages, so other kinds of ecosystems, but not the German-speaking one. And obviously, it was important to have an insight also in this particular ecosystem. We used a mix of methodologies. I will not go into detail. You can, of course, find all our results, deliverables, as we call them in EU funding speak, on the Zenor website, where it has a separate menu point dedicated only to this project. So just very briefly, we, of course, used quantitative, but also qualitative methodologies. And I will present to you a few results that are perhaps more interesting for the broader public. So I will start with just a couple of items of surprise. So this is what I also like to ask every time there is a presentation on a research: what kinds of things really surprised you during your research? And I want to share with you a couple of them. 5 actually in number, before actually also presenting you a couple of infographics to illustrate what I'm saying here and going a little bit more in detail. So the first surprising fact is really very much a half surprise, because there was anecdotal evidence in the research community that the actors themselves in the broader far-right scene are actually quite interrelated. However, there was always a denial officially that there are links between, you know, the more extreme parts of the scene and the more, let's say, populist part of the scene. Now, as we have seen in the project, there was, of course, a lot of linkages between these two. The far-right scene is very strongly interconnected. So what we really saw very soon was that we're not just dealing with extreme right actors, but also with quite a high and strong presence of right-wing populist actors. So in the English language, it's actually quite convenient to say the far right because it encompasses both. But the point is that there are, you know, the two intertwine quite a lot, and not just in terms of connections, but also in terms of discourse. A second point of surprise has to do with this thesis of the salad bar, basically, or the buzzword, the salad bar ideology, which says that nowadays, you know, ideologies are very mixed. So people pick and choose from various kinds of ideologies to create their own. Well, in our case, it was a mixed bunch. So on the one hand, of course, we saw that the various parts of the scenes basically used in part the same kinds of ideas, but they also had specific markers. So in our project, we identified 4 communities which had specific dominant kinds of ideologies. The third surprise has to do with the linkages between platforms. So what we know, for example, from the research on jihadis online, on, you know, Islamist actors online, one usually assumes that there is an evolution from TikTok to Telegram and other more fringe platforms. And this is how we also started our project, thinking that we will find lots of, or at least some, linkages from TikTok to these other platforms. Now, we did find indeed some linkages to other kinds of course, social media, but also websites, quite a lot of websites with, for example, alternative news, how they call them. But what we found even more, and this is the element of surprise, is that the links from TikTok to Telegram were a lot less than the links from Telegram to TikTok. Yeah, so basically the opposite of what we had thought. And there is a very interesting strategic reason why Telegram links to TikTok to this extent. The fourth element has to do with the qualitative analysis that we carried out. So we use frame analysis, which I will show you in a bit. And there, of course, we have the element of framing, you know, problem solutions and so forth. But what we found even more, and as a bit of a new element, is what we called identity framing. So identity framing was very dominant, promotive of a kind of being Austrian or being German, which was very specific and very different to not just foreigners, but a lot of other members and groups in society. So what that tells me, at least, very clear is that these actors actually do promote polarization themselves. So polarization is not just something that happens out there in society, but it's something that far-right actors really actively promote. And finally, what we also found, and it was counterintuitive, we assumed that the toxicity of hate speech will be higher on Telegram than on TikTok, and it actually was the other way around. So setting the scene in this manner, I'm going to show you a few infographics and information before finishing off and giving it over to Stuart. So this is a bit of a description of the kinds of actors and their features that we found. So initially, there were a lot more accounts that were discovered. However, in a relatively short amount of time, roughly half of them were already banned. So basically, we ended up analyzing a number of 142 users, which might seem a small number. However, if you look at the number of followers, for example, average posts and plays and likes and so forth, you will see that these actors actually have a very far reach with their publics, with the audience. And what you, of course, also can see here just intuitively is how well connected they are. I mean, you can't really, we identified 4 communities. One is right-wing populist, establishment and alt-right, neo-Nazi music subculture, conspiracy-driven pro-Russian activists, and anti-vax far-right. But in fact, they are very much interrelated. Here is an infographic relating to the salad bar, so we can see that, you know, there's these are some standard ideological features that we picked up from the literature, and they were found across the board. But you will see here, for example, there are certain accents, so certain emphases or stronger presences of some of these ideological features in some of the communities. Right. This infographic relates to the linkages that I mentioned before. So here you can see, and I mean, the extent to which the breadth of the link basically shows you how many links we have from one to the other. So we have from TikTok, of course, links to right-wing extremist social media and websites, also to some mainstream sources, and political parties, not surprisingly, but you see that the links go back and forth, right? So it's not just one way. And more importantly, what I mentioned before, that there's a lot of linkages to Telegram, to TikTok, from Telegram to TikTok. This slide has a little bit more information of the framing strategies that I mentioned before. So first of all, this idea of, you know, identity framing as we eventually branded it. So this is basically the identity that is promoted, you know, to be autochthonous, of course, Christian, to be regular, normal, but of course, traditional heterosexual. So everybody who is not that is basically branded the enemy, right? So you can see that the kinds of people comprised here go beyond the usual enemy images that we know perhaps from the literature or from the press. So it's not just the migrants and the Muslims, but of course the elites as well, the establishment, the media, the EU, LGBTQ, left-wing people in general, green people in the sense of Green Party people, people who are interested in protecting the climate and so forth. So everybody who is not exactly like essential image of the far right is a problem and an enemy. So the problems that we found are, of course, multiple and in some instances really formulated in the sense of in an apocalyptic sense, right? So basically we have statements like we are the last generation, right? So basically trying to also to motivate through this formulation of the problem that if, you know, nothing is being done, then it's basically the end of this particular group of us. Interestingly enough, migration as such was not necessarily the main problem or the problem that was voiced most often. So actors would use a lot of everyday problems, right? Things having to do with inflation, funding, you know, how the prices are going up, prices of apartments and so forth. So financial arguments that they'll then be connected to the problem of migration, connected to the problem of the war in Ukraine, for example. So the argument was not to say, you know, we should not protect Ukraine because of whatever reason, political or otherwise, but because it makes us poor, right? And on the reverse, so what the solution, of course, the solution was not phrased in very complex terms. It never is in the far right. It's basically just a, you know, very grand promise of having more money to have a better life, for which, of course, certain actions are necessary, especially voting for far-right parties, remigrations, and such. So there's much to say here, but in the interest of time, and of course, there is a deliverable dedicated to this framing strategy, where you can also see what kind of values are being used and motivation strategies and so forth. Here, just to finish up, I also wanted to show you something that relates to the fifth, as it were, surprise point. So here you can see on the graph how basically on TikTok, the level of toxicity or the level of explicit hate speech is actually higher than on Telegram. And this is counterintuitive, because you think that, Telegram should have more of it, considering that it is, of course, more difficult to access, especially from by the authorities. And this whole thing is basically is part of a strategy. So what we have found here is part of a strategy for mainstreaming extremism, which is shown here in this last slide that I have. Yeah, thank you. With this, I will, if there's questions, of course, I can talk more about this. Also the colleague Eric Hake, who is the main responsible for the analysis, both quantitative and qualitative. And with this, I give it over to Stuart. Please introduce yourself, and we look very much forward to your presentation.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much to Daniela and to the Recordar team for the invitation to speak today. I'm Stuart MacDonald. I'm a professor of law at Swansea University in the UK. At the university, I'm the co-director of CyTrek, which is the Cyber Threats Research Centre. I'm also the coordinator of the Voxpol Network, which is a global research network with members from around the globe that are working on issues around terrorism and violent extremism online. And I organise the Terrorism and Social Media Conference, the TASM conference, which we host in Swansea every couple of years. And I'm pleased to have this opportunity to speak today. My title today is The Use of AI to Detect Hate Speech Online. Well, I'd like to begin with an obvious but important point, which is that a vast amount of content is posted to online platforms every minute of every day. You can see some statistics on the slide, the number of stories posted every minute to Facebook, the number of posts to X, the number of snaps on Snapchat, and the number of hours of content posted to YouTube every minute. And this is just 4 platforms. They form part of a much larger ecosystem. This ecosystem consists of the social media giants with billions of active users at one end of the scale, and small and micro service providers at the other end of the scale. Now, many of these platforms, including the 4 on the slide, have policies that prohibit the posting of hate speech or hateful content. The precise wording of the prohibitions varies from platform to platform, but in general, they prohibit content that attacks people or promotes the use of violence against them on the basis of identified characteristics such as age, race, ethnicity, immigration status, nationality, religion, gender, sexual orientation, or disability. And every year, action is taken against millions of items of hateful content. So in 2024, 26.8 million items on Facebook were actioned for being hateful. In the first half of 2024, 4.95 million posts were actioned on X. Again, the first half of 2024, over 250,000 snaps had action taken against them, and nearly 750,000 videos on YouTube. And it's worth adding to this that there are lots of other types of harmful content that tech companies must detect and remove. These include extremist and terrorist content, violent content, sexually explicit and exploitative content, fraudulent content, content that promotes self-harm, spam, violations of IP rights, and the trade of restricted goods and services. So what is obvious is that content moderation is an enormous task. the vast amount of content that is posted daily cannot all be manually reviewed. Automation is essential. And when it comes to moderating hateful content, in broad terms, there are two approaches that can be used. And often these approaches are mutually reinforcing. So first of all, there's the use of behavior-based cues. So things such as abnormal posting volume, the use of trending hashtags that are unrelated to the content being shared. Well, these behavior-based approaches have some similarities to spam detection. And in terms of hateful content, this approach might be particularly useful when content is being generated and disseminated automatically, such as where bots are being used for what's called astroturfing. That's where you're producing fake grassroots activity. And then there are content-based approaches, which are going to be my focus today. And within this category of content-based approaches, there are broadly two methods: matching and classification. Both involve automation, but it's only classification that involves the use of AI and machine learning. So starting with matching, this can take various forms. For example, some tools rely on logo detection or object recognition. But one particularly prominent matching-based approach involves creating a database of images and videos that have been removed for violating prohibitions on hateful content, then comparing new images or videos to the database to check whether they've been removed previously. So it seeks to stop users from re-uploading content that has already been removed for being hateful. And this relies on what is commonly referred to as hashing. Hashing is when a piece of content is converted into a unique identifier that consists of a string of data. It's akin to a digital fingerprint. Well, various platforms use this. Meta, for example, has created a tool called Hasher Matcher Actioner, and it's made this tool freely available for other platforms to also use. Now, one advantage of hashes is that they are smaller in size than the original item of content, which makes them easier to compute. And so it's easier to check whether there is a match in a large database of existing hashes. Another advantage of hashes is that they don't contain users' personal identifying information. And this makes it easier to transfer them between tech companies, allowing for the creation of shared hash databases. And there are contexts in which shared hash databases exist, including child sexual abuse material and terrorist and violent extremist content. The value of these databases is that if content is removed from one platform, the database can prevent that content from being uploaded to a different platform instead. Now, there are two types of hashes. The first is cryptographic hashes, and these are the most secure. Cryptographic hashes appear to be random, and so they reveal nothing about the content from which they are derived. The drawback in terms of content moderation is that they require an exact match. So even changing the color of just one pixel in an image will result in a completely different hash value. And this means that cryptographic hashing is vulnerable to efforts to circumvent content moderation, such as by making minor alterations or edits to an image or video. The other type of hash is a perceptual hash. Perceptual hashing focuses on patterns in salient features of the hashed content, and it disregards changes that would go unnoticed by human viewers. So visually similar images will have mathematically proximate hash values. The benefit of this in terms of content moderation is that minor alterations to an image will not prevent a match from being detected. But the downside is that perceptual hash values do reveal something about the underlying input, and so they're not as secure as cryptographic hashes. One other quick observation here, because matching-based approaches require the compilation of a database, a significant manual effort is still required. Matching-based approaches may also be insensitive to the use of the same item of content in a different context, such as journalism or academic research, and so human review also still remains important. Turning to classification, and it's classification-based content moderation that makes use of AI, such as machine learning. Classification typically involves using a large corpus of texts, which have been manually annotated by human reviewers, to train the AI to recognize the features of specified categories, such as hate speech. The AI is then able to predict whether a new item of content belongs to one of these categories. Classification tools can produce a score that indicates the confidence level in the classification. So on some platforms, a very high confidence score might lead to content being automatically reviewed, whereas a slightly lower but still high confidence score might lead to manual review of the content. A feedback loop can also be used so that content that is removed is analysed in order to improve the future performance of the algorithms. So that's the theory of how they work, but developing these tools is far from straightforward. First of all, there are challenges in compiling a training data set. And the challenges begin with the collection of the data itself. Existing data sets are not normally made publicly available. And there are obstacles to the sharing of data, such as privacy legislation like the EU's GDPR. Now, platforms might seek to use the content that they remove to build a training data set, but this is unlikely to be large enough. And even if it is, it may not be fully representative of the data on which the algorithms will be deployed. And these concerns about generalizability also extend to academic researchers' efforts to collect data. For example, some researchers compile data sets by using particular search words or search terms. But the danger here is that this might exclude discussion of some topics or some entities. Other researchers have collected data from specific user accounts or specific channels. But this then requires the researcher to ensure that all non-violating content is manually removed. And the violating content may only encompass the terminology of a particular group or a particular language. So collecting data is the first challenge. But there are also challenges at the next stage of the process, which is cleaning and labeling the data. This can be enormously time-consuming and resource-intensive. And as a result, some training data sets are only partially verified, or maybe not verified at all. Labeling the data accurately may also require subject matter expertise, cultural understanding, or specific language proficiency. Now, any errors in these steps will mean that the algorithms are trained on erroneous data. The reported levels of accuracy will therefore be mistaken. And since training data sets are not made publicly available, there is no way of verifying them. So that's compiling a training data set. Regardless of those challenges, algorithmic tools still have inherent limitations, and I will highlight 3 of these. The first is temporal. Data are collected during a specific time period, but hate speech is dynamic. It evolves, often in response to the latest events and popular culture. New terms and expressions are created. Coded language may be used, sometimes in a deliberate attempt to evade content moderation. So the training data may quickly become dated. To try and address this, machine learning algorithms can be retrained after deployment using the real-world data that have been collected. Now, this may improve the performance of the system, but it allows no opportunity for the updates to be manually tested before users are exposed to them. Second, machine learning algorithms have difficulty understanding context and nuance. So this means that they have trouble accounting for things such as subtlety, irony, and sarcasm. And this can be particularly important for some types of content, such as memes. An understanding of context is also important for assessing the purpose for which content is posted. We saw earlier that tech companies' prohibitions on hateful content often refer to the promotion of violence. Well, assessing whether the purpose of a post was to promote violence or some other purpose can be a complex task, and it may be more suited to human judgment. And then third, there are linguistic and cultural limitations. Some AI tools are far less effective in languages other than English. For global companies, the sheer number of different languages is a significant challenge, especially as AI translation tools are themselves not perfect. And these challenges are exacerbated by the need for cultural sensitivity. Dialect and language use can vary across speakers of the same language. For example, one academic study found that machine learning content moderation algorithms had difficulty assessing culturally shaped English usage in countries in the global south. There can also be regional variations in what is regarded as socially acceptable. All of this means that the use of AI tools alone risks inaccuracy and inconsistency. And there have been lots of examples of this. I've put some examples on the slide on the screen. And as you browse those, you'll see that these risks are not distributed evenly. There has been a disproportionate impact on users in the global south. And from a human rights perspective, what is particularly concerning is the combination here of over-enforcement and under-enforcement. On the one hand, you have over-enforcement, Egyptian activists having their Facebook pages shut down, opponents of Assad in Syria having their accounts closed, Palestinian reporting of Israeli raids being suspended. But then on the other hand, you have hateful content avoiding enforcement action, with hate speech in countries including Ethiopia, Brazil, and Kenya not taken down. And this combination of over-enforcement and under-enforcement has generated feelings of mistrust and resentment amongst users in the global south. So far we've seen the undeniable need for automated tools, but also their limitations. So how can we harness the best of automation while also mitigating its drawbacks? Well, first, oversight mechanisms are essential. They're necessary to correct errors when these inevitably occur. But oversight mechanisms have other benefits too. Oversight ensures accountability. It facilitates the sharing of expertise. It builds trust and legitimacy, and it increases public understanding. And on the screen, you can see three specific types of oversight mechanism. First, appeals processes. And it's not just enough for a platform to have an appeals process. The process should also meet basic standards of due process. And here the Santa Clara principles provide useful guidance. So, for example, users should be notified when their content is removed. They should be given details of the appeal process. The appeals process should be clear and easily accessible. And the user should be informed of the reason for the removal and given the opportunity to present additional information in support of their appeal. Second, transparency mechanisms. One form of transparency is the publication of content moderation policies. As I mentioned earlier, many companies explicitly prohibit hateful content, and they offer definitions of this term. Another form of transparency is transparency reporting, which is now governed by the EU's Digital Services Act. And the Digital Services Act also imposes some algorithmic auditing requirements on very large online platforms and search engines. These audits must be independent, and they must allow access to all relevant data and premises. The Act also requires very large platforms to provide access to vetted researchers for research on the platform's risk mitigation measures. So oversight mechanisms are essential, and so too are human-in-the-loop processes. As we've seen, even where automated tools are used, human input is still required. For matching-based approaches, an ongoing effort is required to identify items of hateful content and add these to the hash database. For classification-based approaches, human input is needed to compile the training data set, to assess the items that the algorithms flag for review, and to consider user appeals. Now, ensuring this level of human input is challenging, especially for smaller companies. The first set of challenges concern capacity, and here I mean capacity in 4 senses. First is volume or workload. Companies with only a handful of employees may not have someone that is able to dedicate all their time to content moderation, let alone focus on just one form of harmful content that needs to be moderated, such as hateful content. There's also the challenge of dealing with content in different languages and from different regions, and the need for subject matter expertise to keep up with the latest slang and symbols and slogans, as well as the latest evolutions in extremist groups and movements and factions. And legal expertise, which is necessary to navigate both national and transnational regulatory regimes. So the first set of challenges concern capacity. Then there is the important need to safeguard the well-being of human reviewers. Viewing large quantities of hateful content has the potential to cause significant distress and upset. So how do smaller companies deal with these challenges? Well, as part of the EU-funded Tech Against Terrorism Europe project, I interviewed a number of small and micro hosting service providers, and they described 3 coping strategies. First, to ensure that content was always removed swiftly, some companies sought to ensure that someone was always available 24/7. And this was particularly important for hateful content that amounted to terrorist content because of the 1-hour removal window that's mandated by the terrorist content online regulation. So the company sought to ensure someone was always available 24/7, but in the longer term, these companies felt that keeping this up, maintaining this level of availability, began to take a toll on their welfare. Another strategy, another way of easing the burden was to show deference. For example, some interviewees said if they received a takedown request from law enforcement, they deferred to the perceived expertise of the law enforcement agency, and they simply removed the content without scrutinizing the request. And importantly, some said they took a similar approach to algorithmic tools. They said they simply deferred to the assumed expertise of the AI. Well, this finding is quite significant in terms of the right to freedom of expression, because it illustrates quite strongly the risk of over-enforcement. And then finally, some interviewees said that they had chosen to pay for an off-the-shelf content moderation solution. Now, this is a growing market that is estimated to be worth $32 billion by 2031. Yet third-party providers are not currently subject to the same level of oversight as tech platforms themselves, including in respect of human rights compliance. So to conclude, I would like to offer 5 recommendations. First, collaborative resources. The compilation of shared resources can help provide platforms with access to subject matter expertise. Such resources can, for example, provide up-to-date information on the latest trends and the latest slang and symbols being used. Second, layering of automated tools. So the shortcomings of individual automated tools can be mitigated by layering or combining different tools. For example, a tool that uses logo detection could be supplemented with a classification-based tool that relies on textual analysis. Third, shared tools with good practice guides. International organizations and governments should support the development of openly available automated content moderation tools, as should the largest tech companies. And importantly, developing the tools themselves is not enough. Work is also needed to ensure uptake. So the tools should be accompanied by a good practice guide that explains how the tool works, its limitations, and crucially, how it can be integrated into a platform. Fourth, research into the impact of outsourcing. So as reliance on trust and safety vendors increases, there is a need to better understand the services that they provide, and in particular, the impact of outsourcing on human rights, given the tendency for smaller platforms to defer to those that they perceive as expert. And finally, minimum standards and AI tools for moderator well-being. So given the integral role that human reviewers play, it's important to take steps to protect their well-being. And AI tools also have a role to play here. For example, they can be used to blur out areas of images, and they can be used for visual question answering, which enables moderators to reach decisions by asking the system questions about the content without having to view it directly. So there are some recommendations, and that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much for this very insightful and very dense presentation. I think we all have a better understanding now on how moderation works. We have a couple of minutes for questions. So I guess maybe, the question which is on everybody's minds is, how has the environment around moderation changed? And what does it mean for moderation? So I mean, I guess there was an assumption of, having a common ground as to what is extremism and what should be, taken offline and what not. And now, seeing what's happening with, formerly Twitter, now X, how can we assess now the accuracy of moderation, or is it already a tool for political advancement?
Well, I think one of the things that's important to say is that collaboration, in my view, is essential. And the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism is a useful example here. This was a collaborative initiative between Facebook, Twitter, as it was, Microsoft, and YouTube that was set up in 2017. And there are lessons maybe to be learnt from the journey that Gipsy T has been on, and those lessons could be applied in other contexts, including hate speech. So one of the key challenges, I think, is onboarding members so that if you develop a very good new resource, a sufficient number of companies actually has access to that. But there are other things to consider besides just ensuring the widest possible access to these shared resources, because by giving access, you're enabling input into the shared database potentially. And so there are questions then to be asked, not just about changes in leadership or changes in the direction of leadership at companies like X or Meta. You're also talking about platforms like TikTok, which you discussed in the opening of the workshop. What are the implications of giving TikTok access to these shared resources? And then extending that further, what about Russian-owned platforms, for example, and how does that feed into concerns about influence in national elections? So when it comes to collaboration, that is the ideal, but it is in practice politically very difficult because of the differences in leadership and in context of the different companies that form such an important part of this ecosystem.
Right. Perhaps just one short question before moving on to the panel discussion. I thought it was very interesting also what you said about training that data sets. Of course, there is a high fragmentation of them. They're not shared, but who should be in charge of doing this? I mean, do you see there a cooperation between research and policy making, or it should be research only, or how should this look like to be more efficient?
So I suppose the starting point there is access to data that could be used to train, and who has the most ready-made access. It's the platforms themselves on which the content is posted. And one of the challenges that has been faced over the years is researchers or others asking tech companies for access to that kind of data and not being able to secure that access precisely because of other legislation such as GDPR, privacy legislation, and concerns about sharing users' personal information for these trading purposes. So you have that initial difficulty of the companies that have the most ready access to the most valuable data that could be used for training. So they regard themselves as unable to share it with academics or other institutions that could compile the training data sets. So that's the first hurdle to overcome. But this is then maybe where AI has some other potential. And there's been some work in recent years looking at possible uses of AI to create kind of simulated data. So to create content that is akin to content that's being posted on the platforms. And then you could create data to feed into a training data set that has been algorithmically generated. So that possibly is a promising avenue that avoids the need for tech companies to share data that might include personal identifying information, and is a use of AI that I think should be explored further.
All right. We do have another question, very concrete. So the question is there, or could you give a rough estimate about the costs of content moderation? Are there any public numbers available? So how much does, this thing actually cost?
I can't recall seeing any figures like that, other than the figure I mentioned in the presentation about the value of the trust and safety vendor market. So $32 billion by 2031. So there's obviously a lot of money in this space.
Or how many people work? I mean, do we even know how many people are used to work with X, for example, for content moderation?
I've seen reports on the number of moderators employed by Facebook, which put the figure at around 15,000. X has always been known as having a smaller teams than that, but I don't recall seeing specific numbers of how many moderators are employed by X.
Mm. All right. Okay, now we have lots of questions coming. I will allow one more before we go to the panel discussion, where we will also talk about countermeasures. So, has any research been done on whether depending on online moderation alone actually reduces feelings of agency of the audience and with it its vulnerability? So, do we have I guess effects on of moderation on I guess radicalization in the end, or vulnerability to extremism?
Certainly in the sense of content being removed can sometimes be exploited by recruiters or radicalizers. So, for example, if you're thinking of conspiracy theories, the fact that content is being taken down can then be sold as proof that you're onto something. It can kind of legitimate the conspiracy theory itself, and the takedown can be presented as suppression of the theory itself. So similar findings have been reported in studies on jihadist communities on social media platforms, where being suspended is almost like akin to a martyrdom, and it's shows that you are a dedicated member of the community. And then as these communities reform under different guises, people talk about their suspension experience, and it's kind of a bonding tool. So I think moderation can play that role in recruitment and radicalization.
Yeah, I guess it's a bit similar to counter narratives, right? So it basically helps for the ones who have not had too much contact to this kind of content scenes, but for the ones who are already radicalized to a certain extent, it might actually lead to more radicalization. Indeed, prevention is more complex than just moderation. I think that's an important message to give. All right, so thank you so much for the input and the interesting answers to our questions. Now we move on to the panel discussion. We have invited also, I think, perhaps different to other panels in the security area. We are quite a few women in this panel, so this is great. We were looking for contributors to a little bit broaden the horizon of what we have been doing. So we were very much focused on Germany and Austria, and we wanted to have input from also beyond these countries. So we invited somebody who is a very known researcher, Birgitte, on the, as it were, the northern countries, in particular Norway, and also Evian, who's been doing very interesting research on women who are perhaps counterintuitively very important actors in this scene as well. So I would like you guys to just briefly introduce yourselves, just about 30 seconds, and then I will start with the discussion. Of course, also contributing is Eric and Stuart. And Eric, please also introduce yourself after the two ladies. So please go ahead, perhaps Birgitte first.
Yes, thank you for the invitation, and to Stuart for this interesting presentation and for your presentation. So my name is Birgitte Honshus. I am a media scholar and researcher at CREX, which is short for Center for Research on Extremism at the University of Oslo. My work broadly concerns far-right mobilization online and offline, as well as anti-Semitism and hate speech online more broadly. Usually study this from a media studies perspective, and as you mentioned, my focus is on Norway, but since this is a kind of a transnational phenomena, I also try to follow the trends abroad.
Thank you so much. Evian, please.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Dr. Evian Leidig. I am a researcher and consultant specializing in online harms and platform governance. I'm also an associate fellow at the International Center for Counterterrorism in The Hague, and an expert member of the EU Knowledge Hub on prevention of radicalization.
Great, thank you so much. Eric, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Eric Hacker. I'm an extremism and terrorism researcher at CENOR, and I've also worked as an analyst on this research project. My work focuses on online propaganda mainly in both the far-right and Islamist extremism spectrum. And using these insights, I've been advising governmental bodies as well as international organizations and grassroots communities.
All right, thank you so much. So perhaps the easier question first to you guys and girls. In your area of research, who would you say are the main or the most effective far-right actors pushing hate speech online? And what are their main strategies? Maybe starting with Birgitte again. Next time I will do it in another order.
Yes, sure. That's a good question. And I don't think there is kind of one answer to who is the main actor. I think as your report also indicates that there is a kind of network of different actors here. It could be like far-right organizations, but it could also be like looser networks and groups of people that promote far-right ideas. Sometimes it's difficult to know kind of who is behind far-right propaganda online. I think that's one challenge, and another challenge is related to this. You mentioned earlier how it's sometimes explicit, but my impression is that it's also often implicit. And it was also mentioned earlier, the use of kind of code words, allusions, conspiracy theories. It doesn't have to be very explicit, and that's another challenge. It takes some kind of background knowledge and context and be able to interpret to actually know that this is kind of far-right ideas and what they really mean.
Yeah, so if I may jump in here, I very much agree with Birgitte's analysis, and certainly we see a broad range of actors, both identifiable and known actors, as well as anonymous accounts, sometimes bots, actually, like Professor McDonald mentioned in his presentation, who will often work congruently to promote and to reinforce quite a lot of these hate speech narratives online. And I would also broaden this to not include just hate speech in the legal sense, but also hate more generally, and how that is infused with various phenomena like disinformation and conspiracy theories, etc. Now, within my line of work, I focus primarily on influencers who are very prominent on mainstream platforms in particular, but who will often rely upon what are ongoing conversations happening within fringe or alt-tech platforms, and then popularize that onto mainstream platforms because they have greater visibility and larger reach amongst broad audiences. And with these influencers, they often partake, as Birgitte mentioned, in content moderation evasion techniques using dog whistles or coded language in particular. But perhaps one of the biggest findings that I have arrived at within my research are the fact that most of these influencers are not as explicitly focused on political issues as we might have seen in the past, but more focused on social and cultural issues as a way to sort of drive shifts in public opinion, and in particular to target young people and to focus on perhaps more of these cultural dimensions that are revolved around things like lifestyle, for example, and then adopting that type of identity politics in the name of then promoting their political messaging.
It's a lot of interesting information that you just said there. I made a lot of notes. This is something that we also noticed in our project, by the way. I mean, also what Birgitte said, you know, like hiding, this kind of camouflage kind of discourse, like not really using explicit hate, but also using humor, for example, to kind of circumvent, I guess, among other also moderation or being sued as well. And then, you know, also this looking at more everyday topics, which is a bit, if I may say, a bit similar to what also, for example, Salafi influencers are doing, at least in our region, very much working this lifestyle level before going into more ideological content. So at this point, I wanted to also encourage you to react to each other's inputs, so it can definitely be a discussion as well, and also encourage the audience to ask questions, which we will see here in chat, and I can ask them directly. So Eric, I mean, maybe you tell us a bit more about those communities that I mentioned. They have this kind of general names, but who is behind that?
Sure. I totally agree with what has been said so far. That's also what we found in our research. And I think that's the main challenge nowadays of counter-extremism and counter-terrorism, right? It's unlike 20 years ago, it's so difficult to pinpoint where all this hate and extremist propaganda is coming from. So it's not necessarily just organized groups. It's not just loose networks. We also have a lot of activists, so really everyday people that are just active online, posting their stuff that they're thinking about, producing content. It now also comes from the very mainstream, so political parties as well. And I think it's really become a phenomenon that cuts across all societal groups. So we also cannot just restrict this anymore, like has been said before, to young males. It very much so comes from female influencers as well. So that applies to age too. It's not just young people, it's middle-aged people, it's even old people, especially when it comes to mis and disinformation, So I think that's what makes this whole thing so challenging in terms of who's driving all this, is that in that sense, we're actually talking about a mainstreaming of extremism. It's really impossible to put this on one certain group or one corner of society because it is so diverse. And also in terms of the strategies that we've been seeing, in our sample too, in this ecosystem, this borderline content is what we called implicit hate. This plausible deniability makes it so difficult, not only for platforms, but also for policymakers. How do you deal with this, right? Because if you just look at the caption of a TikTok post on its own, you wouldn't say that it's hateful. If you just look at the video content, it's not necessarily going to be hateful, or the audio. But when you look at it in a context, it might make you think. But even then, it poses the question, is this actually hateful, or is it just how I interpret it? And I think this is the main challenge that we're currently dealing with in this landscape.
Oh, great. Yes, please go ahead.
I wanted to just say a little about the identity construction, which has been mentioned by a few of you so far. And this I think is really quite key, and is something that is enabled by the use of indirect or subtle messaging. So you have the construction of an in-group identity, and then the construction of an out-group identity. And you highlight the positives about the in-group and you downplay their negatives. And then you emphasize the negatives of the out-group and you downplay their positives. And a couple of the techniques that are used to this end are homogenization, homogenizing the out-group, and then suppression. So emphasizing just one or two characteristics and ignoring other characteristics, and linking the out-group to those selected characteristics, suppressing others in the process. So that's an important tool, I think, in identity construction. But then alongside that, it's the idea of presenting a crisis that requires a solution and emphasizing the urgency of this, and using the in-group, out-group framing to describe the crisis that needs urgent action. So I think this identity politics is really important, and the indirectness of the messaging or the subtlety of the messaging actually lends itself quite well to identity construction.
Indeed. So do you see, I'm just going to throw some questions to the whole panel, so please go ahead. Do you see parallels to other kinds of extremisms in terms of the strategies they're using? Would you say, is there a learning effect of the far right from others, or are they really pioneering in terms of what they're doing online? and in particular with relation to hate speech, of course?
Well, I am primarily an expert on the far right, so I can't speak too much to other type of ideological extremist movements. But I will say that oftentimes when I do present my research looking at the role of female influencers within the far right space, I will often hear from my colleagues who will tell me that they've noticed similar patterns and behaviors amongst female jihadist recruiters for ISIS, for example. That is a focus on sort of those everyday topics like themes like dating, female friendships, loneliness, those types of topics. And I think there are a lot of similarities there. However, I do think what is quite important when it comes to analyzing far-right extremism is also, in my view, understanding the role of algorithmic amplification of this type of content, I think in ways that we didn't see with ISIS, for example. So, for instance, a lot of the content that has been proliferated by the influencers I studied, they have, I would say perhaps a lot of it falls into that borderline content, right? It's lawful but awful content, but certainly raises some eyebrows in terms of the potential of a violation. A lot of that content still has remained on these platforms after several years, and there hasn't been steps taken to redress that. By the platforms. And so certainly if we look at how algorithms have been pushing a lot of this content, because again, it's not considered to be violative, but it might be considered apolitical or lifestyle content. It may not be considered problematic in the eyes of moderation efforts.
But would you say that there might be also a bias? And this is also something that I wanted to ask Stuart as well. Is there a bias perhaps in terms of moderation towards, looking more into jihadi content and maybe being more lenient on the far right one?
There's certainly differences. I think if you go back a few years, a lot of content moderation efforts depended on designation lists. That's changed a bit in recent years, where there's been a movement towards more generic definitions of content. But the early kind of reliance on designation lists did mean that there was a focus on jihadist groups, because designation lists are dominated by jihadist groups, and it's taken a while for far right groups to be designated through legal channels. In the UK, the first far right group to be designated was in 2016. That was National Action. In terms of the EU designation list, the first to be designated was last year. That was the base. So groups are still, these lists are still dominated by jihadist groups, and if you have moderation approaches that are constructed upon those lists, then there will inevitably be a disproportionate focus on jihadist groups.
And if I may, Stuart, I was also thinking about some far-right groups who might be designated by certain countries and not others. So one example is the Proud Boys, which is banned in Canada, but not in the US, for example. So how then do platforms make informed decisions regarding the origins of those posts?
And should platforms be having to make those decisions? I think some of the platforms would rather not be in a position of having to choose. They would rather that choice was made for them, which then raises questions about who the appropriate decision makers are in this scenario.
It's actually a very good point. Yes, who should be actually the one doing the moderation? And I guess the European Union is doing some steps in that direction by, having legislation saying that, platforms have to ban certain content within a certain amount of time. So at that point, the platforms only implement, as it were. Do you think that would be a way to go forward?
I think I can jump in here. That would certainly help, but also to come back to the previous point, I think the other issue is the structure of these two scenes, right? So certainly similarities, but also differences. So in terms of jihadism, you mainly have a scene that's dominated by 2 or 3 groups, at least in the West. It's mostly ISIS content, maybe some Al-Qaeda, some HTS. But when it comes to right-wing extremism, the number of groups that we see in propaganda is so much higher. It's also a lot more decentralized in terms of, do you see symbols and logos that help with content moderation? on social media that we're simply missing because the number is too high. Like you said, the designation is simply not there, which makes this all more challenging.
All right. So I guess several of you have mentioned the word, I guess, mainstreaming. And I was wondering, Birgitte, what is the situation in your country? How influential is the far-right discourse in the, say, broader political scene with the public? Do we see this mainstreaming there, or?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say there is definitely some mainstreaming going on. And I would say that's also due to the fact that far-right actors are very good at kind of adapting to different platforms as well, and the kind of media formats, and kind of taking advantage of the different digital media platforms. And I don't think that's only relevant for Norway. It's definitely, and maybe more relevant elsewhere, actually. But yeah, well, there are definitely some mainstreaming of far-right ideas happening in Norway as well. And one example is kind of typical, according to a survey from 2022, 31% of the Norwegian population has high levels of prejudice towards Muslims. And it's measured by kind of asking questions about to what extent do you agree with different statements that you would usually find in kind of these far-right online networks. And 31% of the population, I think that's quite a high number, and shows the kind of the way the far-right definitely has an audience out there. And that's just one example of how it kind of can manifest. But I think we also need more knowledge about how this mainstreaming is experienced by minorities, for example.
True. I think in general, there could be more research on the audience, which is of course very difficult also due to ethical reasons. But the question is always, so what is the effect of all of this, on the public? Do we have to deal with audience that already has certain ideas and attitudes, or do we actually see an effect of the online content?
Definitely. And I think there is a kind of, so maybe the attitudes are already there, but it certainly becomes more visible with how the far right operates online. And I think that might also contribute to the kind of normalization of certain far right ideas.
Do you think that the fact that Norway experienced, that horrible terrorist attack at the time, do you think that basically did some kind of awareness raising of what this ideology can lead to as compared to other countries, or do you see a similar development in terms of, mainstreaming and spreading far-right ideas in society?
I think definitely made us more aware of this phenomena and kind of the worst possible consequence of kind of online radicalisation and extremism. But it's difficult to pinpoint if that has made us more kind of resilient to it. I'm not sure if it has. And I think that's something we have to kind of, as a society, have to work on all the time, I guess, and remember what happened and keep up to date on what is this, what is the far right doing, and how does it affect us as a society.
Exactly. Ask questions and question ourselves as well and our prejudices, I think. So Eric, in terms of mainstreaming, there was a slide at the end on, all of this actually being a part of a mainstreaming strategy. So maybe you could tell us just in a few words, what do we actually mean, or how did we actually reach this conclusion in the project?
Certainly, yeah. So in terms of mainstreaming, what we found is that what the far right is trying to do is move away from shifting a bit from this recruitment from the mainstream platforms towards smaller platforms. Indeed, they turn to using smaller platforms to push content on mainstream platforms. So what that should suggest to us is that they're trying to reach a broad audience. And then when you combine that with this borderline content, with this specific framing that does not say things out loud, what it does is it makes extremist ideas more acceptable to wider masses. And then we also come back to the framing that you have presented earlier, which in what they've been doing is really identifying these palpable everyday problems that people deal with. They are actual problems, but what they do is they identify scapegoats, and then what also Stuart pointed out, this sense of urgency. So portraying all this as an existential threat, saying that if you don't act, then it's all going to get worse. Your existence, your children's future is at risk. And I think that's what they've been pretty successful at in terms of mainstreaming, to identify those topics that get the attention of broader masses, and then presenting all that in a manner that is acceptable. It's questionable, obviously, with borderline content and all that, but it's not a straight out rejection for many people, which then again contributes to these ideas getting more and more accepted, less and less pushback, and in the long term, this could result in overall mainstreaming.
Mm. Evian, you've just completed, I think, recently a very interesting book on women in the far right. So maybe just in a few words, what is special about, the women influencers or the women activists? Because I guess for the broader public, it's a little bit, again, counterintuitive, being used to perhaps more left-wing militant women organizations and movements, and considering the rather perhaps traditional image of the woman in this particular scene.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So when it comes to looking at women in the far right, I should note that there is a long history of women's participation and involvement in far right movements and organizations. But I think what is different today is the amount of visibility that is afforded to women in the far right. And I say this again as somebody who studies influencers, and the fact that there are perhaps only a handful of very well-known or prominent female influencers compared to the broader array of male influencers that we see online promoting these political movements. But primarily in their role as influencers, I find that these far-right women are essentially, drawing upon our previous conversation, mainstreaming and normalizing these much more extreme ideas and making them palatable and relatable to their audiences. And that is a primary function that we see. It's oftentimes why these female influencers do engage in producing that type of borderline content in ways that their male colleagues are much more likely to incite violence or to promote violative content on these platforms and face the repercussions. We see that female influencers are very adept at circumventing those regulatory regimes. Now, that said, I've also had done some research looking into the role of male influencers as well. I have a new article out with a colleague where we look at the Andrew Tate effect and also the broader manosphere of influencers and podcasters. And we see very interesting similarities in terms of understanding this type of reactionary masculinity in ways that also complement the reactionary femininity of the women that I have studied. And a final point that I will make about women in the far right is when I had started off doing my research for this book, I had expected that most of these female influencers would be attempting to recruit and radicalize other women into the far right. I actually found that they have a disproportionate number of male followers, and perhaps more than not, they were tailoring content specifically targeting male viewers and followers in their messaging. And so when we think about the role of gender in recruitment and radicalization pathways, it's often much more complicated than just assuming that women are attempting to radicalize women and men to men. It can often be a cross between these types of gendered pathways.
Very interesting insights. So lots of surprises, I guess, in this in this event of ours, counterintuitive findings. So we're slowly moving towards the end of our event. We already have a couple of questions here, so I will address them individually or in plenum. We'll see, but feel free to jump in as well. So the questions are very much in the direction of, what can we do about it, right? So, and what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. So one of the questions says, like TikTok is of course an issue because it has, it says here great potential to mainstream radical narratives, I guess just because many people use TikTok. So the question is, and maybe I start with Brigitte on this, do you have ideas how to educate people about mainstreaming effects to prevent a public far-right shift? So how can we educate the public? Any ideas?
That's a good and hard question. I think like a recent example from Norway, we have this, I was made aware of a campaign where young people comment on TikTok videos of where the users are usually, or the videos contain young people with minority backgrounds. Mm-hmm. And other young people are writing underneath, like, vote the Progress Party. So that's the far-right populist party in Norway. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of a code word for I don't like you because you're immigrant, or I don't like you because you have a minority background. And I'm not sure if all the kind of young people writing that, whether they actually mean it or whether it's kind of part of a trend. And I guess to kind of disentangle campaigns like that and actually make young people aware what they're saying and how it affects the minority youth they're targeting. I think that would be one way of kind of make people more aware. Talk about it in schools, I guess. At least when we talk about young people. But as was also mentioned, it's not only young people spreading hate online. So I think the problem is also bigger than that.
Do you think general digital education can make a difference? Or it's really something separate? How to deal with fake news, how to...
I guess so, but also make people more kind of aware of what hate speech, how it functions and how it affects people. And although maybe some people don't mean to be hateful, it has an hateful kind of effect, and that's also a democratic problem, I think. If it makes people like not wanting to participate in public debate and so on. So yeah, I think there are kind of different avenues we could pursue to make people more aware.
I guess also uncovering what it actually is and what it actually means, because as we've seen, it doesn't present itself as something explicitly hateful or extremist at the first sight.
Definitely.
Yes, Evian, please go
Well,
ahead.
I think Brigitte is hinting at a very, we need a whole of society approach in addressing the harms that can result from hateful digital content online. As I think Stuart was very good at outlining at the end of his presentation, the various content moderation tools and practices that should be employed from a regulatory stance. Also broader education and digital and media literacy, as Brigitte was alluding to. But I think one avenue that has been underlooked, and perhaps again, this is because I look at influencers, but the role of counter-influencers in this space to create that type of organic content that helps to debunk or to demystify a lot of these far-right talking points. Because as Eric mentioned, several of these activists are very attuned to being able to articulate individuals' grievances and then provide that sense of urgency or perception of crisis on top of that. And many times these counter-influencers are very good at understanding what are the talking points that are being employed, how can we effectively leverage humor, satire, as a means to be able to communicate to broader swaths of people, and especially to young people who might be facing particular vulnerabilities at their life stages.
Right. So basically from counter narratives to counter influencing, this is to say the next level. Right. I have a question which is definitely for Stuart, so I'm just going to address it to you directly. It's not easy. Do we need to train audiences themselves in emotional intelligence? What do you think?
Well, I think it follows on from Evian's answer just now about needing a much broader approach than just content moderation and improving digital literacy and encouraging people to think about how they engage with materials online. One of the things that I think is quite particular to the far right ecosystems is the use of news stories and news websites as a means of legitimation. And the nice expression that I've seen one commentator use, news sharing legitimization. This is quite a common strategy that you find in the far right ecosystems. But the study that used that term also came to the conclusion that the sources of shared news are seldom critiqued, which I think is quite an important finding, and the need to encourage people to look beyond the headline that is being cross-posted in a tweet or a Facebook post or a TikTok post, and to actually interrogate the underlying news story that is being claimed as an authority for whatever opinions being offered. One kind of stark example of this that I came across in the study we did was where headlines were being used, so outlinked to news stories on Twitter, and the Twitter posts would just have the headline. But so I went and looked at the news stories because the headlines just didn't seem like they could possibly be correct. So I went to the URL and looked at the news source, and there was a satirical newspaper, and the headlines were sarcastic, but they were being retweeted on Twitter as if they were genuine and authentic and being used to support an opinion. And people were engaging with it on the basis that the headline was real. So that's maybe an extreme example, but there is this need to encourage people to look beyond the headline, to look at the source that's being quoted as an authoritative reference, and to think more carefully about what they're engaging with. I also thought it was interesting, Daniela, in your findings in RecoDar, that the more toxic language was on TikTok and not on Telegram. And I've seen that finding in other studies that have employed similar analysis. It's the mainstream platform where the greater toxicity is found. And the reason I think that's been offered for that is that that's where you get that kind of conflict with people of opposing viewpoints. And when you get that discussion with people that don't agree with you, the language quickly becomes more toxic. So I kind of wonder how to interpret that and what to make of that. Is it something to be kind of positive about, that there is that toxicity when people are confronted with those opinions, that they react in that way? Would that put people off that ideology? And is there a danger if people are going to more obscure sites where there's more of an echo chamber, that it becomes a lot less toxic, more ideologically homogenous, and maybe more reasonable sounding?
Yeah, I think that's definitely one good explanation. What we've seen, and I think there's also a parallel to Salafi content in that case, is that, if you place this content alongside other content which is harmless, then you kind of give the impression that it's okay, So it's okay to use this kind of language, to have this kind of discourse. So I see it as part of the mainstreaming strategy, really. Also, which obviously happens in a context where you also have societies where all of a sudden, or political discourses where all of a sudden it's okay to use certain terms which were really unusable, taboo, just perhaps a few years ago. So yeah, but that's definitely a very important signal as to the mainstreaming of this all. So just not to lose the two questions that we still have here. First, somebody is asking, should we rather focus on preventing radicalization in terms of countering extremism, given that, hate speech, misinformation, and so forth are increasing exponentially? Are we joining a losing battle? And then second question, is there already a movement in the software development, big players to bypass AI-based software for online moderation and detection, perhaps again with AI, or I guess with alternatives. So something, is there something beyond AI? I don't know, whoever wants to pick these two questions. Well, one and the other, of course.
I can go first. I'll take the first question. I mean, certainly, I think we're talking a lot about the supply side, meaning what is out there, how do we get rid of this content online? And I mean, besides this panel, there's way less talk about the demand side, right? So the recipients, how do we make society more resilient? Because realistically, we are never going to completely get rid of extremist propaganda online, of hateful content online. So people are bound to encounter such content. So what we should put a bit more emphasis on is really how do we prepare people for this? How do we educate them so that they don't get radicalized? They don't just accept this kind of hate. They don't believe misinformation and disinformation, which is, as been said before, a whole of society approach. There's no one solution, one tool, or one campaign that's going to get us there. But certainly that's something that we need to be looking at. In terms of, are we losing this battle in the West? It might feel that way, given the recent developments, because I think what we also tend to forget is that there's no global consensus of what hate speech is. There's no global consensus that we should even fight hate speech. So looking at the transatlantic relations lately, also in terms of, is it free speech? Do we need to moderate? What do we need to moderate? How big should trust and safety teams be? It's certainly not just a debate on how we deal with this issue, but also a more high-level political debate of, do we even deal with this issue, or do we just let it run its course, which I think is the bigger battle to win. And it seems like at least us in Europe are currently not winning that battle. At least I wouldn't go as far as to say we're losing it, but there's much improvement to be done.
So much to be done. Any ideas of going beyond the AI tools that we have now? Is it the best we can do? Is there something going beyond that? Or not really, not at the moment?
Well, I think there's a few uses of AI that should be explored in a positive way. We've talked about how AI may be, there's lots of talk about how AI might be exploited by malevolent actors, but hopefully I've also highlighted some of the potentially positive uses for AI to help content moderation efforts, whether that's protecting moderators' well-being or using AI to generate data that can be used to train algorithms. So I think when having the discussion about AI, there's a tendency to focus too much on how it can be exploited. But we also should be asking ourselves, how can we use AI for the positive ends to support content moderation efforts and other work in this space. And I've seen some companies begin to explore the use of generative AI to build content moderation systems. I think that's still a fairly early stage, but that is another avenue maybe that would make content moderation solutions more affordable or accessible to platforms with less resources. So I think there are lots of things that we can explore for positive ends.
Oh, right. Evian, please.
Well, I was thinking perhaps a way to link these two questions together is that there has been some really interesting studies looking at the potential of generative AI chatbots to actually help individuals to de-radicalize and or in some prevention efforts to begin with. So they've actually been some really interesting experiments where individuals have asked questions to generative AI about some of their ideas and thoughts, and it's actually helped to for them to rationalize and to reason, perhaps how their emotions are driving their rationale. And I think that is a promising avenue for intervention.
Interesting. So emotional intelligence, we did have it in a question as well. So yes, I can only say thank you so much for all this very, very interesting input. There's a lot to be done. We have some good news, some bad news, but I guess we all continue our work. With this, I wish everybody a great day, and thank you so much for participating in our event. And thank you again, of course, also the public for their attendance and questions. And see you soon.